The complainant was an elderly man and his wife, who lived on a remote farm in rural Pike County, Georgia. It seems that he had been experiencing a prowler on and off for several weeks. However, the prowler was never actually seen clearly, nor was there much evidence, at least until the end of these events, to corroborate that anyone or anything was causing a real disturbance. I would arrive at the home, exit the patrol car, and smell the monster. As the old man liked to describe the intruder, the smell which I initially attributed to the swamp or a nearby neighbor's livestock. After exiting the car, it was a quick walk up the steps and a knock on the door as he wouldn't open it until he heard a human voice. Sheriff's department. I'd call into the home. The door would rattle, and he'd open it. Often, he would be visibly shaken. He was an elderly man and his vision was failing him. "Did you see anything when you came in?" he'd ask. "No, sir," I'd reply. "Well, it's been at it tonight. It was tapping on the house and trying to see us in here. It even came to the front and was trying to open the doorknob," the complainant would share with me. After some brief discussion, I would sweep around the outside of the house and look over the yard. Generally, he'd see nothing. Mostly, I smelled that awful odor like a pig pen with wet dog and rotting garbage combined, but never anything substantial in terms of physical evidence. I'll admit that I was often spooked when doing the normal prowler survey. The hair on my arm would stand up, and I'd have that feeling of being watched. Then I'd check back with the homeowner, report that I had found nothing, and go back into service. This scenario was repeated over several months. I had to respond to this man's calls for help. Please don't think that I minded attempting to help him. I was a sworn deputy and it was my duty to answer all calls and provide service. I tried to take it all seriously, but in all honesty, I had my doubts about the veracity of his complaints. In my mind, I thought that this man was the victim of some type of prank. I figured that he was being harassed and that someone was going to great lengths to drive the old man and his wife out of their home. At the very least, I thought some natural phenomenon was causing him disquiet, and he was mistaking it for a human presence. In fact, it slowly escalated, and as you'll document, you'll see an intensification of nighttime activities and an increase in the level of threat or violence toward the elderly couple. In the beginning, during the first weeks, the victim complained of someone tapping on his home and attempting to see inside. He stated that between 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. a strange light tapping would take place on the exterior of his home. He described it as a drumming sound, like fingertips on a school desk. He said the unknown assailant would circle the exterior of the home making these noises. Of course, the couple was in bed and at first didn't think much of it. I thought they were from a bird's wings or some type of animal, he described to me. So they would remain in their bed and listen in the darkness. Strangely, he shared that his small chihuahua, Peanut, would hide under the living room couch or under the covers of their bed. It seemed that Peanut was terrified of the unknown exterior intruder. He described how it was as if all the normal nighttime sounds of crickets and tree frogs would cease when the drumming sound started. In essence, it was as if everything around them attempted to hunker down and be quiet when the nighttime visitor arrived, hiding until it left the property. All the normal sounds of the night would cease as an early warning signal that the nightly visitor was approaching from the bottomland to the west. I will catalog some of the behaviors that were reported to me. Peeping Tom. He began to notice that someone or something was attempting to see into the interior of their home. His sight was failing him, but he would catch glimpses of a head or half of a face. He described it as an ape man looking into the windows. Fleeting glimpses of an odd football-shaped head seemed to be in tune with their internal household movements during the night. This became worse as the days wore on, and the couple became more aware of the intruder. Later, they would often cut out all of the lights in the home and sit in a central hallway, which allowed them to see several windows at once, watching the intruder move from window to window in an attempt to localize where they were within the home. Whispers in the dark. In time, the old man began to report that the nighttime intruder was whispering to them through the walls. He described it as a guttural, deep sort of rumbling sound. He stated that this would often turn into a huffing sound and on occasion a scream. I will admit that I began to question his competence at this point. I asked the old man if the intruder ever said anything he could understand. He shared that once the intruder had imitated the way he called the small house dog, growling out a low, drawn-out peanut. Tractor tire, A tractor tire, a large rear-pushing type tire, was found lodged in a tree approximately 25 or 30 feet in some high branches. It was no mean feat throwing that tire to such a height, as those tires can weigh several hundred pounds. I could never discern where anyone had used a block and tackle to lift the tire. So one was left to wonder. Corn dog food. The nightly intruder burgled the old man's little barn. Something had twisted off a master lock bolt and hasp without the help of tools and had stolen, perhaps eaten some there, as well several bags of dog food and some cracked corn. One morning, I walked behind his home toward the creek. I had asked him for permission to walk further back onto his land to see if I could find any tire tracks or signs of people along the creek. Once I reached the creek, I walked along the bank for a bit and saw a place of copse of trees overhanging the creek where something had crossed. I saw silt drifting in the creek's water and could plainly see several large footprints that were underwater, and one imprint on a small mud bank kind of shaped like a boomerang. It was shaped like a large footprint. It was huge, and I immediately stopped and looked around to see if the maker of that track was still in the vicinity. This was not long after daybreak, between 7 to 8 a.m., and I had a feeling of being watched. I exited the area. I climbed down into the creek and saw that the imprint was a huge, human-like footprint. However, the entire time, I had a fight or flight response. Plainly, I became terrified and decided to retreat for my own safety. In the air was a strong ozone-like, slightly sulfurous smell, stronger than the normal landfill, pig pen, rotting smell that usually accompanied the activity. Further, there seemed to be a static electrical charge in the air. It was enough to make my hair rise from my arms and neck. Later, this feeling and the other smells subsided and eventually seemed to dissipate. Being off duty, as I had asked the victim if it were okay to return during the daytime to survey his yard, I walked back to my privately owned car and retrieved a bucket of plaster of Paris. I determined to make a cast of the imprint. I climbed back down into the creek and walked over to the mud bank. It was composed of a muddy, pebbly mix of clay. I used the creek water to make the casting mix and poured the cast. It took its time drying, and I looked at the tracks leading to the muddy bank. The track path was hard to determine with any measured accuracy. However, by estimating the length between opposite steps, I roughly figured that the stride length varied between 64 inches and 70 inches, so a forward swing of a leg would cover roughly 3 feet to 5. 8 feet metric. A stride measured roughly 1.6256 mep to 1.778 met. It was an incredible stride. Suddenly, my mind sprang back to the description of the old man and his report of the intruder peeking into his windows, later measured at approximately 5 to 8 feet in height, or 2.86 to 2.4384 meters from the ground outside the structure. My mind reeled at the possibility of such a creature actually existing. I still sought a practical, human explanation for these events. I figured it was a hoax. So I took the cast and promptly left. Strangely, over the next few weeks, the activity declined and eventually stopped altogether. In my mind, this had never had any explanation other than some sort of prank. It was some person or a group of people who wanted to drive the old man away from the property. Then, as if on cue, the entire process stopped, and it seemed that my hypothesis was correct. Whoever had decided to cause the disturbance moved on, and it was over. Perhaps I was in some form of denial. I placed the cast in a closet at my home and really forgot about it. It became a curiosity to me, and one of those mementos that one keeps for no other reason than to have an object of discussion and/or speculation. I let the entire thing go, and it faded into the back of my mind. Later, after examination, it was confirmed by Dr. Jeff Meldrum of Idaho State University to be an actual example of a Bigfoot track, and Mr. Jimmy Chilcutt, forensic fingerprint expert, examined the cast and stated that it contained primate biological identifiers and skin markings, so it really had been some type of creature. Frankly, the incident changed my view of our world. It altered what I had perceived as reality. Before this incident, my world didn't contain any non-human monsters. Afterward, I found myself pondering what entities or things are stalking our planet, concealed within the darkness of night. Still today, I can't answer any questions about the origins of the maker of that footprint that left its mark in Elkins Creek. However, I can say with certainty that something dangerously bizarre, unknown, and unexplained passed my way 24 years ago. Apparently, it seems that sometimes monsters really do make bumps in the night. I was working the midnight shift 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. assigned to 13 Bravo, a high-crime area known for drive-bys, drug deals, gang activity, and just being a shitty neighborhood. I always felt sorry for the people who, due to their skin color or economic conditions, were forced to live there. It was around 400 to 430 a.m., the time when most cops working the midnight shift start feeling the most drowsy. It was a very slow shift, few calls, and almost no pedestrian or vehicle traffic in the area. There were 3 stop-and-drop stores in the neighborhood that were open at that time of the morning. 2 were gas stations, convenience stores, and 1 was just a small family-owned convenience store run by a Korean couple and their 3 teenage kids. Over the years, I got to know the family. Kim was the head of the clan and a former Special Forces soldier from South Korea. Throughout the years he owned the store, he had earned a reputation among the local gang members and druggies as someone you just didn't mess with. He always kept a 12-gauge shotgun behind the counter, and he had used it 3 times when some unlucky punk decided to rob him. There was even one time when he nearly killed a man who tried to hold him at knife point, an idiotic move against a guy from Special Forces. As I mentioned, it was between 400 and 4:30 a.m., and I had parked in Kim's lot in front of the store. I noticed there were no other cars in the parking lot and no bikes near the front door. For some reason, Kim wasn't working, but his oldest daughter was filling in for him. I walked in, and since I was tired and barely awake, I didn't look at the counter and went straight to the cooler to grab a can of Dr. Pepper, my go-to drink to stay awake. With my head down, I started walking toward the counter, and suddenly, through my foggy, sleep-deprived mind, came a sound that I hope I never hear again. The double click of a revolver being cocked and ready to fire. Looking up, I saw the one eye that never blinked staring directly into mine. It was being held by a kid I judged to be around 15 or 16 years old. I could also see that the hand holding the gun was shaking almost as much as my legs, and he was high, either on cocaine or methamphetamine. I was praying it wasn't meth, because for reasons I didn't understand. Meth in the early days had something about it that made a guy fight furiously over a dime. Slowly, I put my hands at my side so he could see that I wasn't about to draw my weapon, and at the same time I started talking to him calmly, telling him not to do something stupid, when he screamed at the top of his lungs, "Put your gun on the ground." I remember thinking to myself, I'm not going home this morning. Marcy, my wife, is going to be so upset that I messed up and got killed. She's going to be so mad. What came out of my mouth before I even had time to think was, "Now, son, that's not going to happen. You kill a cop, they're going to stick a needle in your arm, and you'll try to breathe slowly, and then you'll piss yourself and shit your pants, feeling an immense pain as your heart slowly starts to stop beating." Of course, I was just making that up as I went along. I looked at Sandy, Kim's daughter, and told her to put all the money in the drawer and hand it over to him. Now the kid looked really pissed off. His eyes went cold, and his voice turned monotone, emotionless. He said, in a voice that still gives me chills, "I'm not your son, you piece of shit." I knew at that moment it was over. He was going to shoot me between the eyes, turn, shoot Sandy, grab the money, and leave. I remember thinking, "I'm sorry, Marcy. God, I love you, Marcy," when the loudest sound I'd ever heard almost ruptured my eardrums and then exploded in my brain. I thought I was dead. He shot me. I'm dead. At the same time, almost in slow motion, I saw the kid's head, from chin up, simply turn into a pink and gray mist. His head was there 1 second and gone the next. There's no way to describe what it looked like. You'd have to see it to understand. Unbeknownst to me, Kim had been restocking the fridge and was getting ready to relieve his daughter. He saw everything from the glass refrigerator doors and grabbed his shotgun because Sandy hated guns. Kim had made his way to the left side of the kid, and when he saw the kid about to pull the trigger, he simply squeezed the shotgun's trigger, exploding the kid's head. Believe it or not, all of this happened in less than 5 minutes, from the moment I parked in the lot to the moment the punk's body hit the floor. That's how fast things can go south. After I left the PD and started teaching at the academy, when I would tell cadets about this, I would always tell them, be aware of your surroundings. By that, I mean, know what's happening around you at all times, know who is where, and what everyone else is doing. And for the love of God, don't go into a stop and rob without knowing who else is in the store. I work for a small town with just under 2,000 residents. We're out in the country, and there's only one officer on duty at a time, so I'm usually alone. The sheriff's deputies will back me up if there's a serious call or if I ask for help over the radio. The officers patrol the county and are typically about 20 minutes away with lights and sirens, so I have to keep that in mind for any situation I find myself in. I'm alone for at least 15 minutes. One autumn night around 2 a.m., I get a call for a welfare check a few miles outside of town. A woman had called the dispatcher asking us to check on her ex-husband because he hadn't been acting right lately, and she was worried. Since this call is outside my town, it's technically a sheriff's call, but since it's only a few miles away and the deputies are tied up, I didn't mind responding for them. I head to the house, mentally going over what he'll say and how things will go during my short drive. Calls like this are pretty routine, and they usually end with me determining that the person is physically and mentally fine, or concluding that the person is injured, or a danger to themselves or others, and needs to go to the hospital. If my smooth talking can't convince them to go willingly, you'll have to force them, but my silver tongue has never failed me. I arrive at the house, which is surrounded by dense forest with about 400 meters of access road. I can see a light on in the front bay window. I get out of my squad car, walk up to the front door and knock a few normal times. No response. I knock louder. Still no response. I radio in and let them know I'm not getting an answer at the door. I ask them to check our system for a phone number and try calling him, asking him to come to the door. Dispatch says they've already got him on the line. 20 seconds later, I hear over the radio that he called and said it's best if I leave, as he's sitting in the woods with a rifle aimed at me while we're talking. My mind raced as I looked toward the dark trees, and I slowly walked back to my squad car. I felt oddly calm until the final few steps before I reached the squad car, when I felt the panic of someone chasing me. I jumped in my squad car and sped off, and just for the record, as far as I could see once I was inside my car, no one was chasing me. Several hours later, he surrendered without anyone getting hurt.